Hey HCDA, and welcome back to my Satisfactory 1.0 Masterclass. In each episode we will have one specific goal towards that you should ideally be able to complete in 1 or 2 sessions. And today is not actually going to be what I promised you the last time around, because I got a little bit ahead of myself promising you we would be massively expanding the factory, because actually there's a couple of things you should be doing first, and that is what we're going to do in this episode. First and foremost, I would recommend that you find yourself one of these nice little purple nodes that give you access to SAM ore. You don't necessarily need to bring this all the way back to your main base, but you do want to make sure you set up a little mining facility to make sure you have access to whatever amount you might need. Now, typically these nodes are very slow if you find one of them, so you might want to speed things up by using some manual miners as well. Now, assuming you also found a couple of Mercer spheres along the way, and you probably will because those things are not particularly hard to find, you can now start unlocking the Dimensional Depot. Remember, if you want to find these things the fair way, you could say, without looking at a map, remember just to carry around the scanner at all times when you're moving around the world, and you will pick up these signals so you kind of know where to look. However, honestly, most of the things you need a lot of you can pretty easily find if you do just a minimum amount of exploring. Anyway, back on topic, what this allows you to do is build these dimensional depots, which serve as a kind of an upload to the void where you can easily get all your stuff from. Now, if that sounds a little bit weird, because honestly it is, the way it works is that these dimensional depots function quite differently from your normal depots. Basically, whatever item you try to put in here is then slowly uploaded to the cloud, you could say. Then if you start building stuff, you can actually access those resources from anywhere in the world. So no more forgetting one stack of, let's say, in this case, steel beams. Nope, you can just get it and put it in your inventory if you need it. Now, of course, there is a drawback to this. It's not like you have infinite resources anywhere in the world, because as you can see, it takes a long while to load back up. But it's a very easy way, for example, things like these modular frames that you typically don't carry around tons of, you also don't need massive amounts of. You can still upload a stack to the cloud, and then if you want to build a couple of buildings somewhere and you just ran out, well, it's right there waiting for you. Now, you will notice that you have quite a bit of upgrades available to you. For example, you can start increasing the amount of stacks that you can store in the cloud, or you can start upgrading the upload speed, or you can even start uploading things from your inventory. However, keep in mind that all of these upgrades actually cost Mercer spheres as well as actually building these things in your mall. So make sure you balance the upgrades between actually getting these depots up and running and uploading stuff to the cloud. I do think that getting at least the first upgrade for one additional stack and then potentially the upgrade for increasing the upload speed is definitely worth it. After that, the cost ramps up quite heavily, so make sure you only get those if you really have the Mercer spheres to spare. Now, these depots are also perfect for these out-of-bounds locations that you don't really want to connect to your main base, but you also every now and then need some resources from, for example, the SAM ore itself. I mean, uploading the reanimated SAM to the Dimensional Depot is going to not be fast, let's be clear. It's going to take a very long time. But while you're doing other stuff, this is going to give you a couple of stacks. That means that you can easily craft a couple of Dimensional Depots whenever you need them. But let's be clear here, the main goal here is to get all the items that you might need to build a base into your infinite inventory. As you can see, I hooked up pretty much everything we have in our mall, with the exception of the stuff that goes into the elevator, up to one of these depots, and it's now flowing into my interdimensional inventory. Now, the nice thing is, whenever you build something, by default, the game actually takes it out of this inventory that gets automatically replenished, assuming you set it up correctly. So you have to carry around a lot less stuff whenever you go and then out to build something new. Now, of course, keep in mind that things like concrete, for example, you need so much of if you build a sizable factory that you're still going to want to bring that by yourself, at least until you get all those upgrades. But it's definitely going to save you a lot of backtracking in the future. Something else that you might want to unlock at this stage of the game is the Nobelisk Detonator if you have any sulfur around. You need some sulfur to make black powder as along with coal, and it allows you to make these bombs that you can put on pesky rocks that get in the way, or pesky creatures that get in the way, and blow them up. However, more importantly, you can use those Nobelisks to blow up these gas clouds that are kind of getting in the way a lot of the time. However, almost as cool as the Dimensional Depot is the Blueprint Designer that you can now unlock. Now, unlike some games, blueprints in Satisfactory are actually not super easy to make, and they're also limited in size. It needs to fit in this large box over here. Now, I don't recommend that at this point you're going to spend hours making awesome looking blueprints. I mean, you can, but it's not necessarily efficient. What I do recommend is that whenever you go and build something that you know you're going to be building again somewhere else, specifically if it's something you really like for example, I have this layout with the bar with all the power connections and stuff like that, put it in the blueprint first, and then make sure that you save it so you can just replicate it wherever you go and you don't have to rebuild that same thing over and over again. Once you make something you like, make sure you save it. And then when you go to your build menu, you can find your blueprints over here. Now you can organize them in whatever way you want by using the edit button. You can add categories, which makes sure you have things here on the side that you can give an icon and a name, just so you know what is going to go in there and where you can find stuff. And then once you make your smelter setup, for example, in this case, and I want to move it to something else, then I can go here and hover over this. And yes, I know this is actually a little bit counterintuitive, because initially what you would expect this to do, let me go back. What I initially tried to do myself, at least, was just try to just drag it in here and drop it, just like you would like in Windows. That doesn't actually work. So you do need to go in here, drag it, and then drag it so this is highlighted, and then drop it in. But then you can organize your builds in whatever way you want. You can also add in multiple subcategories, so you can fine-tune your organization. Make as many of these blueprints as you want, but specifically focus on things that you're going to use again and again. On a completely different note, this is the perfect time to go out and hunt for some hard drives and to scan those hard drives in your MAM. Remember, it takes 10 minutes to do so, and in the meanwhile you can't do anything else in your MAM, so make sure that you pick your moment. But once you do unlock some of these hard drives, you will get access to alternative recipes. Some of these recipes are completely useless. Let's say the alternate automated miner. Well, you can make miners from rods and plates normally, but you can also make them from pipes and plates. Why you would want to do so, I have no idea. However, most of them do have quite a bit of use, and some of them are just plain up better than what you have normally. So for example, the cast screw recipe actually allows you to make screws from iron ingots themselves. So rather than making them from iron rods, what you would normally do, you actually cut out the middleman. So you need no constructors to make iron rods. You just simply put the ingots straight into the constructor, and then you make screws. And on top of that, the recipe is actually slightly faster than the normal recipe as well. So this is just a strictly better recipe than the base one. And just to stick with screws for a moment, there's also variations on the same theme. So for example, there's also a recipe that allows you to make screws from steel beams. Now, not only is this a little bit more efficient than the one you have normally, it's also super fast. So you can actually make an entire Mark III belt full of screws, well, almost, and it only costs you a single constructor to do so, assuming, of course, you feed in steel. So you do need to make the actual steel, so that's the downside. But on the upside, you get a huge amount of screws this way. Or you can just work around screws altogether. For example, with the stitched iron plate recipe, you can make the reinforced iron plates, which normally cost normal plates as well as screws. But in this case, the recipe still asks you for those plates, but you put in wire instead. So you don't need to make those thousands of screws. The counterpoint to that is that even though this recipe is just about as fast, there are also recipes that basically just take the same inputs as before, but do so in a more efficient way. So for example, over here you can see the bolted iron plate, again, makes a reinforced iron plates and still takes plates and screws, but it actually works at about 3 times the speed for almost the same materials. You need a little bit more screws, so that's definitely a downside because everyone hates screws, but at the same time you get 3 times as much output from the same constructor. And then some recipes completely change how the game works in terms of the resources that you need. So for example, you normally make wire from copper, but there's also an alternate that allows you to make iron wire, which means you only need iron and not copper in order to make the same thing. Now, when you're unlocking these hard drives, the good news is that you will only get recipes for things you can actually build. Assuming, of course, you don't get something like increased inventory slots, which is probably better than everything else. So if you find this one, I would recommend you to pick it up because, well, having more inventory is always useful. However, you can also see that even this relatively early in the game, there's already a ton of alternative recipes, so that makes it a little hard for me to guess which ones you have. I highly recommend that you go out and find as many hard drives as you can, but even then, depending on what you pick, you might have certain recipes available and others you don't. However, remember that you can always just rescan the hard drive if you want. This instant, you can only do that once per hard drive, so make sure that you don't want these basically. But at the same time, these recipes will come back into the pool. So it's not like you decline your recipes and you will never get them again, but you will need to find new hard drives in order to unlock them later on. Right, so now if you're feeling overwhelmed, don't worry, I'm going to go through some of my favorite recipes. And this isn't a strictly you should always pick this from now on type of thing. It's mostly dependent on where you are on the map and what you're trying to do and what resources you have available right there. But there is a couple of recipes that I think are, well, very useful to have if you can pick them up. Let's start with anything relating to screws. I already mentioned these recipes, but it's worth mentioning them again. Cast screw is probably one of the best recipes early on in the game, so pick this up if you find it. And steel screws is also very good, just because it gives you a massive amount of these without a lot of work. Similarly, there's a couple of recipes that allow you to just skip screws altogether, which is the stitched iron plate that I showed you before that lets you replace the screws with wire. And there's also actually steel rotor that allows you to make the rotors from completely different materials actually. You use the pipes and wire instead rather than the rods and screws. Speaking of pipes, you can actually also find the recipe for iron pipes. This means you no longer need steel, but you need, well, iron. You do need quite a bit more iron to make the pipes like this compared to when you use steel. On the upside, you don't need any coal, so that makes it a lot easier to make them pretty much wherever you need them on the map, rather than relying on that coal. Similarly, I really like the recipe for iron wire because it allows you to make wire without needing copper but using the iron instead. Now again, this recipe is less efficient than the base recipe. It's actually slower as well, so use this only if you really need, but having this available is super useful. Speaking of which, of course I always get the recipes that I want together. Encased industrial pipes, something we'll be using moving forward. This is actually one of the things that we haven't built yet at this point. But you can make the encased industrial beams from pipes and concrete rather than from steel and concrete. And you might be wondering, well, huh? Well, actually making them from pipes makes it a lot more flexible because you just saw we can make the pipes from iron. We can make concrete from limestone, obviously. And this allows us to make these encased industrial beams anywhere on the map, almost, without, again, needing any coal. And then one more recipe that I really like is the solid steel ingot. Now this actually allows you to increase your ingot production by quite a lot, but you do need to add in some smelters in order to make the iron ingots first. Are all the other recipes useless? Well, no. I hope I made that clear by now. There is use cases for pretty much every recipe in here. There's a couple of them that are objectively, I guess, bad. Like, again, the automated miner, for example. But most of them do have their uses, so you can't really go wrong by picking whatever you can. But I would recommend that you keep them just in your library and just pick the recipe when you need it, rather than just picking it up front without having a use case for it. That just allows you to be a little bit more flexible moving forward. One last thing about recipes, and then I am going to shut up about them, but it's really important that you know these things. So once you start planning out your factory, you might wonder, well, do I have all the recipes? What recipes do I have? It's especially annoying because you don't want to place down machines, because some recipes are maybe made in a smelter while others are made in a foundry, even though it's the same item. Now, the way to find that out is pressing O on your keyboard, at least the way to find this out in the game, and then going to your recipes tab over here. Now let's say I want to make screws. I can look it up and click here, and then I can see that there's 3 recipes I have available to make screws, and then I can decide, oh, do I want to make them from rods, do I want to make them from ingots, or do I want to make them from steel? I can also see what that ties into, so how it affects later recipes down the line. And you can actually also see, if I pick something else, I probably don't have all these yet. Yeah, so for example, here I can see I have 2 different ways to make steel ingots at the moment, but I don't have 2 unknown recipes yet. So there's actually 2 more ways that I could make these steel ingots that I can find out about by using hard drives. Speaking of moving forward, that does put me in a bit of a pickle, because honestly, from this point on, I don't know what recipes you have available, and you might not have the recipes available that I have. So for the next builds, I will be showing you what you should be building if you only use the base recipes, but I will make the actual build using some alternative recipes, mostly the ones I like the most, and again, that's completely personal preference, so that I can ensure that even if you're trying to play along and you don't have the recipes, you can still build what I am building as well, but you might need to scale things up and down a little bit, depending of course on what recipes you have available. But once again, I will show you what you need if you only have base recipes. Now, speaking of all this hard drive stuff, where do you actually find them? Well, pretty much anywhere in the world, and again, you can look up a map, but I would recommend that you scour your starting region, whichever that is. In my case, it's the Rocky Desert. And if you're a new player, I also recommend you check out the southwest corner of the map. That's the grassy fields. There's a lot of those crash sites there that are pretty easy to find because it's a relatively flat area. And in both of these zones, all the crash sites are pretty easy to open. They mostly use the items that you have available already. And remember, now we have set up our interdimensional depot. You can just grab those items from your void, and you will not have to worry about finding a crash site but not having those items on you. Some of them use power. Just set up a couple of biofuel burners and power it up, and then take them back down because you don't want the random power to be out there. And last but not least, there's actually a couple of them that don't require anything. You can just walk over, open them up, and voila, you have another hard drive. Now, of course, you can go across the entire map if you want to, but that will take you quite a while, so it's probably not advisable to do that at this point. But again, if you want to have all the alternative recipes available to you, then by all means go and do that. Now, in the next episode, I am going to be working towards completing Phase 3, and I know that sounds weird considering I actually didn't complete Phase 2 yet, but that does mean I'm going to assume you've done a little bit of preparing before the next episode, and again, this is the perfect stage of the game to do that. First and foremost, I'm going to assume you've upgraded your coal power facility from something that looks something like this to something that looks a little bit more like this. Now, to be specific, these are 48 coal generators, each producing 75 megawatts, so that's 3,600 megawatts of power, so that's a lot more than we had before, all being powered by a total of 24 water pumps, and then on top of that, of course, we have the miners. Even though upgrading a build like this is pretty straightforward, let me give you some tips and tricks, especially considering this is the first time we're actually upgrading a facility. So, for one, I am actually overclocking the miners. Now, by default, it is set to 100%. This is a Mark II miner now, so it's already producing 120 per minute, but we can overclock it to 200%. And this is one of my favorite ways to use overclocking in the early game, specifically for power, because you can never have too much power, and there's also a limited amount of resources. Specifically, coal is something you don't find everywhere on the map, so when you're going to use it for something like power, you might as well make the most out of it. Keep in mind that overclocking to 240 per minute is already 4 times as much as what we had before, but you could technically overclock it to 270 per minute as well, so 4.5 times as much as what we had before. However, that would require an additional power shard, and I honestly don't think that is worth it, but again, it's completely up to you whether you do that or not. Now, of course, that means that we need to upgrade all the belts to Mark III, and you need to double check if you don't have any leftover belts for Mark I, for example, because that will completely destroy the optimization of your build. However, in order to avoid that, especially when you're building new belts, I like to only bind the Mark III belt to my bars. That way, whenever I start building something new, I will automatically always start at the highest tier. Well, right now, at least, Mark III is the highest tier, but when I unlock Mark IV, I will switch that up on my bars as well. Same goes for the lift. I, by default, have the Mark III lift on my belt, but if I want to use any other lift, like Mark I or Mark II, just press E, and the game will automatically shift to the relevant belt. So you can still very easily use the other ones as well, same holds for the belts, but at least by default, you'll always pick the highest one, and it's better if you make an error and put a faster belt in somewhere than sticking a Mark I belt in by accident and then finding out hours later that your build is not actually running. Now, when you're going to be scaling up that build, you're going to need to build a lot of these complex type of connections, at least if you are following my build. Of course, you can do it differently, but a very easy way to build connections like that, again, is using the blueprints that we just unlocked. So you can go to your blueprints, you can set that up once, and then you can just make sure that you can just copy paste that. It's not the full connection in this case because I still have to hook up the lifts and stuff like that. That doesn't really work that well if you do that in the designer, but at least I don't have to worry about the spacing and connections between these. There's a Mark III belt already in here, for example. This saves you a lot of work. Another building tip with blueprints is that you might sometimes have a bit of an issue lining the builds up to where you want them to go, because it can be really hard to tell what you're doing if you're in a cramped space like I am over here. Now the way to solve that is just to place them in a more convenient location so that you can easily see what you're doing. Press H, then double check if everything is correctly set, and then you can use the arrow keys to actually move your thing around. So you can see like, okay, so this is in the correct position, maybe it moves, needs a bit moving to the left, to the right, whatever. Oh yeah, this looks good. Place it down, and there you go. So that avoids making all of those mistakes that, well, I at least usually make when I try to do it manually myself the correct way the first time around. Now, let's say it's still not in the location where you want, then sometimes it can be really annoying with blueprints that there's a lot of different items over here that you need to delete. Remember, if you press R, you can now switch to the blueprint dismantle mode, and you can delete an entire blueprint in one go. So make sure that you keep that in mind if you're building with blueprints, because that makes your life a lot easier. Now you might be wondering, why aren't we just overclocking the generators? Couldn't we just do that? Well, yeah, you can. As you can see, the building, if you overclock to 200%, for example, does actually produce twice as much power. So it's definitely a way to save you some building. However, you're going to be building quite a bit of generators. So you could, in theory, scale down the 24 generators that we have now all the way down to 12 again. But you would also need 24 power shards. So that's quite cost inefficient when it comes to those power shards, if you ask me. Speaking of overclocking, remember you can also underclock your pumps, and you can set them to 75% if you keep the 2-to-1 ratio. So one pump for every 2 coal generators means you can put every pump to 75%, and it should still be working just fine. And well, considering how many of these water pumps you actually need to keep this build working, all that underclocking is definitely going to save you a whole bunch of power. Now, as impressive as 3600 megawatts sounds, if you look at our actual factory, it's already at 1/3 of that. So we can triple our factory, which is honestly quite a lot, but this is not going to last forever by any means. So if it feels like overkill, trust me, it's not. Between actually completing your power build as well as hunting for hard drives and setting up your awesome dimensional depots, this is probably going to take you several hours to do. Probably maybe even a little bit more, depending on how much hard drive hunting you do. Bonus is that in the meanwhile you should be completing phase 2, so I'll assume you have that done before the next episode. Now that actually brings me to the end of this episode. In the next one we're going to be working towards phase 3. I hope you found this useful. If you're still here, you're awesome, and I do hope to catch you in the next one.